This is Todd with Todd's Dodge Garage. Today we are going to be working on a 1966 Dodge Charger instrument cluster. In my last video I showed you my process to repair a burnt out needle. As you can see, this cluster here has a burnt out needle here. The tack is frozen. The needle does not go past 1000 RPMs. So the tack is frozen. Speedometer is frozen completely. So this cluster needs a complete restoration. We're going to show you step by step what we do to go through it. It's going to be a multi-step video. One thing you can do is you can test continuity between the terminals on these gauges. The fuel gauge actually feeds these two gauges the fluctuating 5 volts. So the amp gauge, the speedometer, and the tack are independent. The fuel gauge, the amp gauge, and the coolant temp gauge are tied together. So it's very common that one or all of these 3 gauges will burn out. There's a voltage limiter inside the fuel gauge that takes 12 volts in to this terminal. This is where your car's harness hooks up. This is the signal or sending unit wire. This is the 5 volt wire. So the limiter inside the fuel gauge takes the 12 volts in, puts out a fluctuating 5 volts out, and then that feeds these 2 gauges the 5 volts they need to operate. This limiter will stick, and it'll stick closed, and it'll send 12 volts to the 5 volt wire, which in turn will feed 12 volts to these 2 gauges. The wire inside the gauges cannot handle that, and it fries itself, and it cooks the wire and or the bimetallic strips, which deems the gauges inoperable at best, and in some cases can't be repaired. So this is a cluster that I got to restore. Obviously we're going to have at least one needle repair, which is on the amp gauge. What I'm going to do is set you down and we're going to start the process. What we're going to do is by removing the fuel gauge and opening it up and inspecting the wiring inside the fuel gauge and see what we have. I had mentioned earlier you can test continuity between the terminals on these gauges, and so I'll show you that very quickly here. It really doesn't do a lot of good because all it does is tell you that you have continuity, and we're going to see if these 2 gauges read anything. So the coolant temperature gauge shows open, so we already know that that's cooked. The oil pressure gauge shows open, so we know that's cooked. Now, I could tell that automatically when I was just pushing the needle. I can tell by how tight this is, how sprung it is. The fuel gauge, we can do the same thing with. We test continuity across, and it doesn't matter which way you do it, the 5 volt wire and the signal wire. Now I'm showing about 20 ohms of resistance between those 2 terminals. .6. Okay, well that's fantastic, but that doesn't tell you the condition of the wiring, if it's cooked inside or burnt. We already know that damage is going to happen because these 2 gauges are cooked, so they got fried somehow. They got fried because the limiter in the fuel gauge stuck closed. So I'm going to just set you aside here, and I'm going to remove the fuel gauge. We're going to start with that. And all I'm doing is removing the nuts that hold this gauge in place. This here is just a condenser for the radio. Now, once you get those nuts removed, you still have the wiring for the electroluminescent lighting. And you want to be very careful removing this wiring that you don't damage or break this terminal off of the face. Otherwise, that won't light up. This terminal here feeds the needle. Now what we're going to do is drill out the rivets that hold the gauge face in place. Okay, so now we've drilled out this one rivet. And that's all we need to do to slide the gauge face out of the way. Now, this tang here and this tang you have to open up, but you have to be very careful because they will just break off. So I have my tool and I just stick it in there very carefully. And I just pry them open a little bit. Now, you're going to want to take your finger and hold the needle in the center position so that the gauge face will slide past it when you open it up. And we are seeing this together for the first time. Oh yes. This here is the voltage limiter, and that is a set of points. So this heats up and it opens and closes these points very fast. And that's what takes 12 volts and basically cuts it down to a fluctuating 5 volts. Now you can see that the wire is burned here. And it's really burned here. So what we're going to do is we're going to have to rebuild this gauge. What happens is the sheathing is a fiberglass fabric kind of insulation. And after 58 years, it becomes very, very brittle and it starts to flake off. What happens is when it flakes off, the wire comes in contact with the bimetallic strip, which is what the wire is wrapped around. When that happens, you have a short to ground. When these points stick closed, you get 12 volts that goes out the center stud here. So 12 volts comes in this stud, 5 volts fluctuating is supposed to go out this stud, and then this stud is your signal wire. This is internally now. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the wire off of this gauge. We're going to disable these points because I'm going to put a different voltage limiter on this cluster so that we don't have to ever rely on this gauge or this limiter sticking closed and causing damage to the other two gauges, which we already know have damage because they show open with the ohms test. So I'm going to set you down here again. And the first thing I'm going to do is disable the limiter. And I simply do that by cutting the black wire that connects the 12-volt stud to the point side. Then I simply cut the nichrome wire that connects the wire to ground. The next step is to cut the wire that connects or that's wrapped around the bimetallic strip here. So now we have cut this wire. Now this wire is not available. It's not obtainium. Okay, so I would not recommend that you just start cutting your wire. I'm just showing you the process that I use to restore these gauges. I have a spool left of actual correct nichrome wire that Chrysler used to build these gauges with, and I do not sell my wire to any other repair shops or individuals, because when that wire runs out, it runs out. But this is how I rebuild these gauges. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and remove the wire from the gauge. And the first thing I need to do is I need to remove the needle very, very carefully. Because if you watched my last video, then you know how delicate and these needles are. And under the paint, it's coated in glass. If you crack that needle or break it, it will no longer light up. So we want to handle this with extreme caution and care. In addition to that, you do not want to start bending this bimetallic strip, because this does move, and that's how the needle swings. The way this works is 5 volts in one side, resistance on the other. It heats up because it's a resistance wire. It transfers the heat to the bimetallic strip. The bimetallic strip actually starts to bend or arc in a fashion like this, and the needle's attached to the end of it. The more it heats up and bends, the more the needle swings. The more the needle swings, the more indication you have on your gauge as to where the fuel level is. The resistance comes from the sending unit. So when I go to remove wire from this gauge, I handle this with the utmost caution and care. And so it's a little bit of a process, because you have to unwind it by hand. And even though I'm holding the needle outside of this copper needle holder, and I'm physically bending it so that I can get the wire out, I'm not actually putting a permanent bend in that wire. I'm handling it very, very slowly and very carefully. Now, I don't know if you can see this on camera, but I'll show it to you when I get the wire off. The wire is actually, the insulation is actually flaking off as I'm taking this off. And that's what we were talking about earlier, is the insulation is old and brittle and it flakes off. And the wire itself comes in contact with the bimetallic strip. And I'll show you what it looks like, how it burns the bimetallic strip. Once we get this all removed, this is a very delicate process to do this. This is not something, if you're going to attempt this, first of all, you need to get the wire, which I don't know where you're going to get it from. But secondly, you have got to make sure you do not bend that bimetallic strip in any way. Because remember, if you're going to build your own gauge, you've got to be able to calibrate your own gauge when you're done. So I don't know if the camera's going to focus in on the wire. But if you look close, you can actually see where there's silver in between all the bends. So where it's bent here and here where it wraps around the bimetallic strip, it has come in contact with it. Now if you look close, you can see just how burnt the bimetallic strip is along here. I mean, it looks like it's been on fire. And this side is all rusty. And that happens on every gauge because the way the current flows through the wire, it actually heats up one side of it. And so the side it heats up is the side that bends. And of course, this is the side, if you wind the wire properly, it's going to heat the correct side. If you wind the wire backwards, it's going to heat up the other side, and the strip may bend backwards, or it's not going to bend correctly for the right ohms readings that the sending unit gives it, so the needle can work correctly. So now what I'm going to do is just start to clean this up, which is I'm just scraping off some of the bad boogers and rust. Just kind of trying to get it back to something we can work with. I'm just going to take it over here and spray it out. And it's cleaning up pretty decently. There's a good angle of it. We've got a lot of that black charring off of there. It's kind of hard to do this and hold it in camera view when you're doing it yourself and trying to very carefully look and monitor the work I'm doing. And we're just cleaning up all the burning and the charring, getting back down to the bimetallic strip. And that way, when I go to test it, I'm going to be able to determine if this is in fact a rebuildable gauge. It's kind of like scales on your teeth when the dentist is scraping. That's what this reminds me of. Now I'm going to clean up the other side a little bit. And you don't want to go crazy, otherwise you're going to damage the strip. You're just trying to clean it up. Because remember, the whole goal is to restore this gauge. That's what we're doing here. When we're done with this cluster, it's going to be a fully restored cluster. And I'm literally just using my fingers as sandpaper. And sorry that I'm getting out of camera view at some points. I can't see. I'm videoing this with my phone and I can't see the other side. So I'm just using my fingers, actually, kind of as sandpaper. I'm just feeling for stuff, and the skin on your fingers is rough enough that it will clean this up. And I'm feeling the bimetallic strip for its, I call it springability. I kind of know what to feel for because I've done so many of them. I'm also looking at it and inspecting it to make sure that it's going to be suitable to be a rebuildable gauge, because remember, the wire's not available, so I'm not going to waste wire on a non-rebuildable gauge. And now I'm just testing the bimetallic strip now that I've cleaned it up. A little more cleanup is going to be required on this one to get the continuity that I want on this gauge, which does happen. This is not a fast process. To do this right, it takes time and patience more than anything. And we're just cleaning things up here. Remember, the way that this works is this bimetallic strip, which is the top piece here, it accepts heat. So you don't want to scrape off the top layer of metal. You just want to clean it up. Otherwise, you lose the bimetallic properties. It's kind of hard for me to show everything I'm doing on camera. But I'm now testing my continuity. And you don't want to see continuity. You want to show open. If at any point you see continuity, your gauge is done, because you have gone through the bimetallic strip portion and you are down to the base metal. Okay, and that tests very good. So that is what I do to test and prep the gauge for rebuilding. I'm not going to show you the process I use to wrap the gauges with wire. It doesn't do any good because wire is not available anyways. But I'm going to show you what we do. This is how I restore these instrument clusters and these gauges, and at least what I do for prep work. So with that, I'm going to continue on, and then I will bring you back as soon as I have the gauge wrapped. So now I've got the fuel gauge rebuilt. I've got my new nichrome wire wrapped around it, as you can see. I've got the needle reinstalled in the gauge. What we're going to do now is we're going to test for initial calibration. Okay, I calibrate these gauges and I test them, you know, half a dozen times from start to finish. But now that we have rewrapped the gauge, we're going to test initial calibration. So in order to do that, we have to set some equipment up. Now, on a fuel gauge, 73 ohms of resistance is equivalent to empty. 9.6 ohms is equivalent to full. That's the Stewart-Warner calibration points. 22.8 is half a tank. Now, what I'm doing is I dialed in my equipment. I've got 22.7, and it's kind of fluctuating. The tenth of an ohm isn't going to make any difference. But again, this is initial calibration just to see where I'm at with this gauge and how close this is to proper operation. Okay, so now your power wire, which is the 5 volts fluctuating, would go to the center stud. Your resistance, or the signal wire, would go to the signal wire stud. And now, if we rebuilt the gauge properly, we're going to watch that needle move. If it's close to calibration, it should rest on or about half a tank. And you can just set it down. And they move slow. I mean, it's electromechanical. And again, what's happening is that wire is heating up, and it's heating up the bimetallic strip. And I'm just kind of making sure I got a good connection on the back. And I mean, from initial standpoint, from not having done anything but inspected the gauge, disabled the voltage limiter, unwrapped the original wiring, cleaned and tested the bimetallic strip. It passed all tests. Rewrapped the bimetallic strip with new nichrome wire, which again is not available. You can't get it in stores. There's no wire company that makes this nichrome wire. You can buy uninsulated nichrome wire all day long. But to get this correct wire is non-existent. So don't just start tearing your gauges apart and then hoping. But this is resting right at half a tank where it should. Now we can test for full calibration as well. And in order to do that, we take our signal wire off. We adjust our resistance to 9.6 or approximately. Because again, a tenth of an ohm or a couple tenths for initial calibration isn't going to make any difference whatsoever. What we're trying to do for initial is just make sure that we are in the game, in the ballpark. And depending on how sensitive your equipment is, mine is very sensitive. Sometimes it's kind of hard to dial in exactly. But we're going to get close here. There. We'll call 9697 good for the resistance that I'm applying to the gauge. Okay. And then we just take our signal wire, hook it up to our signal side, and we let the gauge go. And we're going to see where the needle rests, because this simulates a full tank of fuel. So again, 9.6 ohms of resistance would be a full reading on your gas gauge. So if you have a full tank of fuel and your sending unit is calibrated properly, it's putting out 9.6 ohms, or it's creating 9.6 ohms of resistance. And I mean, look at that. It's right where it needs to be. This little line here is actually the full mark, not the white line. This is the Stewart Warner calibration point. So this is full, this is empty. So they give you, some fluctuation room. This is why that 1/10 of an ohm isn't a big deal. It's not like 1/10 of an ohm is equivalent to half a gallon of gas. You're not going to run out because it's calibrated at 1/10 of an ohm plus or minus. The one thing I don't do that everybody else does is they calibrate it with an actual sending unit. I know this because businesses do talk to each other and we know how each other does our stuff. I have very specialized equipment built and designed, and it's not hard to build equipment where you can set resistance. So when I'm calibrating gauges, I'm actually dialing my equipment. I'm setting the ohms resistance I want specific to Stewart Warner specs. I'm not just using some random sending unit. Each sending unit, especially today's remanufactured ones, are known to be garbage and they don't calibrate for boo. So basically, our first step in this cluster restoration has now been completed. So with that, we're going to wrap up this video, and I'll be back with another video on the next step in this gauge cluster for this 1966 Dodge Charger cluster restoration. So until that comes out, please like, please subscribe. Until then, we'll see you later. Take care.